Unit 3. Listening Skills. Exercise 8.
That lecture last week on global warming really got me thinking. I've decided I'm going to do my assessed presentation on global warming.
Well, there's certainly enough information on it. How are you going to narrow it down? You can't talk about the whole subject in 15 minutes.
Yes, I know. I've started doing a bit of background reading, and it's fascinating, really. I always thought global warming was a relatively recent thing. So much of the information is about events like the Kyoto Protocol. But apparently, scientists were talking about it nearly 200 years ago.
Really?
Yes. I read that Jean-Baptiste Fourier made a prediction in 1827 about the Earth getting warmer due to an atmospheric effect, which he likened to a greenhouse. So he is in fact credited with coining the term the greenhouse effect.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought it would have been later. So scientists back then were aware that there might be a problem?
Well, yes and no. You see, there were a few who, like Fourier, proposed that there could be a potential problem with global warming, but at this stage no one really knew that the process had already begun.
So when did they begin to realise?
Well, most people didn't really take the whole thing seriously until temperatures started to show a significant rise in the latter part of the 20th century.
Surely temperatures started to rise before then?
Yes, of course. Throughout the earlier part of that century, average temperatures were in fact rising, but only very gradually. And of course, some scientists were monitoring the situation. They rose by 0.25 degrees Celsius during that period.
That doesn't sound much.
Well, I know it doesn't sound a huge amount, but the trend was definitely upwards for 40 or so years. It didn't last, though, and from about 1945 onwards, a lot of scientists lost any interest they might have had in global warming, as the world's temperature showed a downward trend for the next few years.
Why was that?
Well, most scientists reckon it was due to emissions of aerosol sulfates from industrial and volcanic activity, which can have a cooling effect on the atmosphere.
So scientists didn't really sit up and take notice until much later?
That's right. And it wasn't until 1979 that there was enough concern for the World Climate Conference to call on governments to take action to prevent further climate change through human activity. Another thing I didn't know was that greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide weren't recognised as playing a part until 1985.
As late as that?
Yes, I was surprised too. Way back at the end of the previous century, scientists suggested that carbon dioxide and the burning of fossil fuels could affect global temperatures, and this was generally accepted throughout the 20th century. But it was 100 years later that they discovered that actually there were other gases apart from CO2 contributing to the greenhouse effect.
So a lot was happening around that time?
Yes. The 80s was a record-breaking decade for temperature highs. When you compare the temperatures of the coldest years in the 80s to the warmest years 100 years earlier, the 1980s was still warmer. Towards the end of the decade, the USA and Canada suffered a severe drought, which killed thousands and cost around $100 billion in damage. This, as well as other extreme weather events, was presented as evidence of global warming. It was only then that the world at large really became aware of what a huge issue global warming is.